Hi, I'm Jim Huling, and I want to welcome you to Execution Insights. You know, when most people think of patience, they imagine just having to wait. And they think of it as being something passive or hesitant, or I think some even think of it as being something weak. But real patience is something very different. In fact, I believe patience is a discipline of readiness. You see, it's not about delaying because you can't decide. It's about holding steady so that when you do act, you deliver the best response in the right tone and at the right moment. Now, this really came home to me a few years ago. I was hired to work with a senior executive in another country. She was recently promoted several additional levels and had dramatically expanded the size of her team. And even though she was well qualified and very smart, the pressures of this new role had pushed her far outside her comfort zone. In fact, the stress fractures were beginning to show everywhere. And in tense moments, it turns out, she was reacting quickly and badly, and she was leaving scars all over her team. So when we began to work together, the first thing I asked her to do was to read with me Viktor Frankl's magnificent book, Man's Search for Meaning. And as we progressed through that book, chapter by chapter, she discovered this thing he calls the space between stimulus and response, and the power we have in that space to choose how we're going to respond. Now, as soon as she learned this idea, it took hold of her, and she began practicing what we started to call claiming the gap, meaning grabbing that space and choosing intentionally before you actually respond. Now, at the very beginning, we had to start simply. And so the first thing we did was focus on taking a breath before she spoke. No matter what the stimulus was, no matter what the problem was, no matter what her own frustration level was, we agreed she would just take a breath before she spoke. And that one discipline made a huge difference. But over time, she learned to use that space not only to avoid reacting in a bad way, but to resist the urge of all the old habits and instead to calmly and intentionally choose her response. And that one switch changed everything. In fact, in the year that followed, her leadership grew steadier, her team began to trust her again, and her confidence returned. So, from this story, I feel comfortable offering you this truth. Patience isn't weakness. In fact, patience is strength. It's the discipline of readiness, choosing not just what to do, but when to do it and how to do it. So here's a question for the week ahead. Where in your leadership do you most need to claim the gap and have the patience to pause before you respond? When you do this, I promise trust will grow, openness will flourish, and you and your team will experience a connection maybe unlike anything you've ever had. I'm Jim Huling. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next episode of Execution Insights.